closest to your home or closest to the place of work, your place of work. Someplace you can walk to. So think about that place. Everybody got one? Great, thank you. I'm Hartsell, and I see a lot of familiar faces, and thank you all for coming. Any of you who are not familiar with me, I'm the Community Gardens Program Manager at Green Spaces Alliance, and green spaces are really important to me. I believe that the future health of our cities is wholly dependent on us having access to green space in our urban environments. I've lived in San Antonio for 13 years. During that time, I've had the opportunity to travel to Istanbul, Turkey 5 times. I've also traveled a lot of other places. And every time that I get to travel somewhere, my favorite part of travel is going to a city and getting to visit and experience the green spaces that are there. But there's a big problem for our cities. Throughout the world, they're facing really high rates of population growth and really high rates of urbanization. And that's no different for San Antonio or for Istanbul on the other side of the world. We have choices. When cities face that high rate of population growth or that high rate of urbanization, they have a lot of pressure to do structural development. But we do have a choice. We can do like on the left in London and build a little structure, infill between 2 buildings, or we can do like they did in Catopolis, Michigan when a building burnt down and put in a little parklet. We do have choices. Both structures and green spaces offer a lot of benefits to urbanites, and both are valuable. Both are very valuable. But our cities cannot thrive without green spaces, publicly accessible green spaces. And here are 2 examples. The Riverwalk. We're all familiar with the Riverwalk. There it is. That's in Southtown near the Blue Star Brewery. And this is Gezi Parku in Istanbul. And that had a lot of press last summer. You might remember there were riots because the people there were fighting to protect that urban green space from development. So you may think that on 2 sides of the world, how are these 2 cities even possibly comparable? But I have 2 districts that I'm going to talk to you about and demonstrate to you everything about that I learned about their distribution of green space. So in San Antonio, we have the Central District. This is our Central Business District. It's also called Centro District. And in Istanbul, we have Beyoğlu Belediyesi. And that's right in the heart of the city. As the cities go, they're both border cities. Istanbul on the border between Asia and Europe. San Antonio serving as a major border city for Mexico. They both have really long and rich histories. They share similar climatic and geographic characteristics. And they both suffer from sprawl and development pressures, as I've explained. As for the districts themselves, they're very similar in size. They're about 6 square miles each. They both have a really strong relationship to water here in San Antonio. It's our Riverwalk. It's our river itself. And it's why this city was settled here. In Beyoğlu, it is to the Golden Horn and to the Bosphorus. Both of these districts have lots of mixed uses. It's residential, it's commercial, it's industrial. They have green spaces in these districts. And they have one unique feature that they share. It's a pedestrian way. In Istanbul, it's İstiklal Caddesi, and that is a pedestrian street through the heart of Beyoğlu, and it has a trolley that runs up the middle of it. It has limited access by automobile traffic. There's a few places where cross traffic can get across. And in San Antonio, we have something very similar with our Riverwalk, where it's pedestrian-friendly environment. It also has the barges that cart people up and down the river. So these are the study areas. And throughout the presentation, Central District is going to be on the left, and Beyoğlu will be on the right. Central District is bordered by Frio Street on the west, I-90 on the south, Cherry on the east, and the I-35 corridor on the north. For the Beyoğlu District, it's bordered, as you can see, by water on pretty much three sides. The Golden Horn here and the Bosphorus. And then along this side, it's a string of streets that were defined by the government of Istanbul. So this district was predefined. And then once I had identified the two districts, I created borders around each district. So these are buffers or accessibility zones. What they indicate is that a person living, say, right here, who may not have access to a green space in this direction, could walk a quarter mile in the opposite direction and still have access to a green space. And I use the quarter mile as the industry standard. It's also the measure that Clarence Perry used when he was setting an ideal distance for children walking to school. So that quarter mile buffer, you're going to continue to hear about that quarter mile walking distance throughout my presentation. You'll notice that there's some gaps in the buffer, in that accessibility zone. These are areas where people are discouraged from pedestrian access because of either a highway intersection, a railroad, or a creekway that's not been developed for pedestrian access. Of course, in Beyoğlu, it's that you can't walk on water. So you'll also note the yellow, and that yellow line is our Riverwalk, and here it is the İstiklal Caddesi going through the district. So another thing that I want to point out when we're looking at the comparison between these two districts is the density. So you can see that the urban fabric in Beyoğlu is a lot tighter than in San Antonio. And if we zoom in to the geographic centers, I've highlighted the footprints in white of all the buildings at these geographic centers. This is a quarter mile area. And so you can see that San Antonio is not near as dense as Istanbul is. So when I'm creating my inventory of the green spaces, the publicly accessible green spaces in these two cities, I had to identify common characteristics. First of all, they have to be nature-scaped. That means that they are predominantly covered in lawn or in trees or in landscaping. Doesn't mean they can't have sidewalks. It doesn't mean there can't be a patio or a rubberized area around a playground. They just have to be predominantly green space. In addition, they need to be publicly accessible. This doesn't mean that there's no fence or that it's a certain ownership. This doesn't mean that they have to be government-owned and operated green spaces. So the variables are the fencing, the ownership, and the uses, and it can be any use. It could be, like I said, a playground. It could be a dog run. It could be a cemetery, so long as it's green space and it's accessible to the people. In addition, it could be owned privately or publicly. Again, it doesn't matter so long as it's publicly accessible. And here we have a couple examples. In Central District, we have Chris Park here on the left. Chris Park is a private property developed as a public park here in the district. It has a fence. It's locked up at night, but it's still publicly accessible. On the right, we have a children's park in Beowulf, and it has a fence, as you can see, but that fence is not to keep people out. That fence is to keep the children from falling off that ledge. It's predominantly green space, even though it has a play set. So those are the characteristics that I was looking for when I was creating the inventory. So once I had identified those, I went through each district and found those green spaces that fit those characteristics. And you can see in Beowulf that there are a lot more green spaces. In fact, they have twice as much land area in green space. That's 122 green spaces in that district of about 6 square miles. In San Antonio, we have 66 green spaces at half the land area. This is the areas that are, these are the green spaces that are accessible to people in those districts. So I created a quarter-mile buffer around each of these green spaces. And you can see a pretty good example right here. There's a little green space. And here's the quarter-mile buffer. You can kind of see the roundness of it. So you can understand that it would go all the way around. That would be the service area where this green space serves that district. Okay? So those are all blended together. And in Beowulf, they have a 97% service rate for their green spaces. In San Antonio, that's 86%. So you can see that there's some gaps in those service areas. Those are called green space deserts, and they're outlined in red. And in San Antonio, in the Central District, we have 9 green space deserts. These are places where people do not have access by a quarter-mile walk to a green space. In Beowulf, there are only 4. So I wanted to find a way to fill that gap. So I went back to these 2 districts and sought out possible sites that could be converted. These are private property sites where I felt that they were in a good place to serve these green space deserts. In some cases, there will only be a need for 1 new green space, the red dots, to serve that entire green space desert. But in other places, like these 2 larger green space deserts, multiple new green spaces will be needed to serve that area. So I have 2 examples. This is an example in the southwest corner. This upper picture is in the southwest corner of Central District. And it's obviously a green space. It has trees, it has lawn. It does not have a fence, but it is private property. So it's not publicly accessible at this time. It's not indicated as publicly accessible. The photo on the bottom, right there, is in Beowulf District. It's in a residential neighborhood. It obviously has lots of green trees. It's accessible from the sidewalk. There's no fence around it. It, again, is private property. And actually has a for sale sign right there, if you read Turkish. And, and so that's the problem that we have to face. And so there's a number of tools we can use to try to convert some of these privately held green spaces into publicly accessible green spaces. We start with research. Research is the mapping that I just showed you. That's an example. You have to create an inventory of what exists and what is possible. You can also use an evaluation matrix that is a site evaluation matrix. And I actually created one of these, and I'm going to show that to you in a moment. As far as policy, We need comprehensive plans for our cities that include green spaces in the plan. Savannah, Georgia is a great example. They started out with a master plan, and fortunately, they still have a good distribution of green spaces throughout their city. We can also use zoning, like overlay zoning or incentive zoning, and we can use tax deductions in the same way that larger landowners can achieve like an agricultural exemption or a conservation tax exemption. But there's more hurdle to this, and that is getting people to do it. So we need private-public partnerships. We need as private landowners to be convinced to participate in this effort. And we need the public to get engaged, and we can do that through service learning, get people out there volunteering in the community. And great examples of that are neighborhood projects like community gardens, where the communities are actually engaged in creating publicly accessible green spaces. So this is my evaluation matrix. I know it's really tiny, you can't read it here, but we're going to zoom in a second. I just want to walk you through how you would process through this evaluation matrix. So you'd start with a site, and you'd evaluate that site against the characteristics that I've listed across there. And there's a number of site characteristics, and then there's a few area characteristics. So an example of an area characteristic that you would evaluate your site for would be whether the area lacks green space or whether it provides green space. So in your quarter-mile walking area, is there one or isn't there one? That's a good reason to install a green space if there isn't. So you'd put a little tick mark if it lacked green space right here above it. And then going over to the site characteristics, there's an example here of flooding. If a site is prone to flooding, or if it's in a flood zone, that's better suited for using as a green space. If not, if it didn't experience flooding, then you could put a tick mark down here and say, no, it doesn't have flooding. That would indicate that that characteristic of the site would be more useful, or not necessarily more useful, but as an option, you could do a structure. So once you go all the way across with all the characteristics, and you've done all your tick marks, then you would score them. So you'd score the tick marks here for all of these, and you'd score the ones across the bottom here. Whatever score is higher would be what is the highest and best use of that site. So if it's scored down here, it indicates that your highest and best use would be to do a structure. And if the highest score was here, you would do, your highest and best use would be for creating a publicly accessible green space. Once you've done those scores, you can go and you can look at whichever direction you've gone, and you can look at either the benefits in green and the benefits in, and the costs in red for each decision. So this is a zoom in of the upper left panel. And so we've inserted the site, we've done the characteristics, we've got a score, and we've chosen to build a new publicly accessible green space. So now we can use these benefits, the human health, the environmental, and the economic benefits, to evaluate our decision and to support our decision when we're trying to convince the private landowner and the public that this is a good idea. As a result of my study, I've identified 3 guiding principles for the establishment of public green space. Using the tools that I just mentioned and the research. First of all, they need to be beneficial. Green spaces have economic, environmental, and health benefits to the urban population. These benefits and these resources need to be accessible to all people, no matter where they live. And my study has shown that it is feasible to have good distribution of green space even in the densest of environments. Thank you. Questions?
Population of each of those study areas?
So in my study, I found that, and you may guess, that the population is higher in Istanbul. I was not able to find the district population for people living in each district, but Istanbul is about 13 million people, whereas San Antonio is 1.3.
You mentioned 6 square miles. Do you have a figure for what the density is on average in each of these?
I have it for the cities, and
so you don't have it for the districts, so.
No.
Okay. Because it would be interesting to see what that comparative analysis would be between the two.
I actually considered the population densities of these cities and of these districts in my study initially, and I determined that it didn't matter whether a green space was serving 1,000 people or serving 100 people, that all those 100 people needed access equal to all those 1,000 people. So they just need that quarter-mile access, no matter how many people there are.
Did you distinguish between passive and active recreational needs in the spaces?
No, it's all together, just so long as people have access to that green space. Yeah.
First of all, I would like to say that was a wonderful presentation. You're a great presenter, and it's a very interesting project. And I just had 3 comments or points, and you may have addressed all of them in your paper because I know you're only given a limited time for the presentation. One comment is actually really small. When you were first presenting the maps with the parks, I would recommend, instead of actually talking about the count, so the number of those green spaces, I would actually look at percent coverage. That's a little more interesting because that really captures what's going on before you even do your buffer analysis.
Yeah, and in my paper I do have
perfect.
I have the actual square miles that each of those cover.
Okay.
It's the square mileage of parks in Beirut is almost a square mile, and in San Antonio it's 1/5 of a square mile.
Okay, so see, that's very interesting. The second point that I wanted to make, and I believe this is just an assumption that you need to point out, and you probably do clearly in your paper, but it looked like when you were doing your buffers that you said for your inventory, you were, as long as it met your criteria. But what you're doing is making an assumption that all of those spaces are of equal quality or value. And some of them may be very large spaces with a lot of amenities, where others may just be these little pocket parks. And those may have different types of uses or value to the community. So, and I think what you did is you took into account all of them. So I would just clearly outline that that was an assumption that you made in your paper to point out.
I actually made a delineation in my paper that it can't be like a parkway tree line. That doesn't count. That doesn't count. Landscaping next to a building does not count. That it actually has to be a place that people can engage in the space.
Good. Okay, that's great. And then my last point is you talked about a little bit about the policies and how important some of those policies are, either in the comprehensive plans or other policies for the city or the region. And I was just wondering if you were able to look at the policies in both areas and then how that actually matched how many service areas it was actually met as well. So meaning, does San Antonio, since they came in a little bit less for percent coverage for the service areas, how different are their policies than Istanbul?
It's a very interesting question, and I did not address that in my paper. It was mostly because I couldn't get all the data in Turkish.
Right.
But what I have observed is that in San Antonio, we do not have a strong green space policy compared to other U.S. cities, because I have done that study in other classes, that our policy is not as strong here in San Antonio, which is why we have such a low park to population ratio here in San Antonio.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you for Good to see you, first of all.
Yeah,
And thank you for this consistent presentation. Good to see things side by side, and you were from the beginning, at least from the minute I stepped in. It was really consistent to see this comparison happening, visually and information-wise. I do have maybe a couple of comments. You might have addressed them in your thesis already. But density is an important thing to look at, particularly the zones that you're focusing on. And if you don't have it for them, because each one of them a multiple of neighborhoods, at least the one I know of is San Antonio Inner Loop, you may calculate it. You may calculate it if you want to. You can estimate the comparison in density of the built-up area or people per square mile or square kilometer, or units per acre, if you will, but that's going to get you a lot of complexity because of the land use typology. But addressing the density is a major thing. Number of people is another thing. You mentioned it doesn't matter 100 to 1,000. Actually, there is a standard recognition for city quality of life that tells us, at least in the U.S., that the access to open spaces, green spaces, is counted as number of acres per 1,000 people. If you want to stick to this standard, it's fine. If not, you need to probably address some of the other global standard that has been used. But there should be something, say, this quality is better or is equivalent or less than the other quality. There should be that comparison as well. And percentage is important. It's not only the count, especially as you mentioned, there's 66 areas in San Antonio. There might be actually better than the 122 areas in Istanbul neighborhood that you looked at, because we have very low density, regardless of what's going on with the increased density. The 66, I don't know how many acres they are, but how many 1,000 people they are serving, they might be much better. Which may not help your recommendation, by the way, but it should be addressed.
Yeah, there have been other studies done looking at the quality of green space, and in the scope of my study, I couldn't do that. I would have liked to have had the time to actually do the footprints of buildings and then have that be the built density of the environment, because that really is the comparison to San Antonio, because our built density is so low that people do have access to green space that isn't publicly accessible. It's in backyards, for instance. So there is that. There are the benefits occurring in our cities as far as natural environment providing benefit to our cities, but they are not publicly accessible to everybody. And my point is about access. Everybody needs to be able to walk into a green space and have that first-hand experience. There are the secondary benefits and the tertiary benefits of exposure to green space, or happening in your realm, green space happening in your realm and providing benefits for air cleaning, for instance, filtering the air of particulate matter. But having that first-hand exposure to a green space and be able to step into it is the point that I'm trying to make. So.
That's correct, but what's happening if you're comparing downtown San Antonio with Manhattan? You have 1,000 people residing in the quarter mile, while here you're probably going to have 100. So if you're talking about access, both of them will have access, but you're going to have overcrowdedness.
Well, not everybody's going to go at the same time.
Well, I hope we're going to get to that point of comparison anyway. But access is good, but density is part of it, because of the overcrowdedness and the serving the open spaces.
Which is why I think that having green spaces every half mile is so important, because you can, if this one is always crowded, you can go over to this one that isn't so crowded.
Another important aspect is the profile of the population as well. I would guess that in Istanbul you have a very high resident population in that district. If you're looking at the population in the central district, you're primarily looking at a lot of tourists, less of a resident population. And then also office workers, how they would come into that play too. So I'm talking about a study, if you want to do a dissertation.
Yeah, it actually is something that we discussed in the process of developing the scope of my
Right.
research, because I wanted these green spaces not to be just accessible and just considered for the residents, but I wanted a person who's visiting the city to have that same experience, or business people who are coming into the city and they want to have a lunchtime experience, for them to also be able to experience green space. Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
I do have two of the maps up here, and if you get up close, you can really see that urban fabric, and so I thought that would be cool for you to have that opportunity. And in the back of the room, both Nishma and I have brought snacks, so there's Turkish Delight in the back. And then we have a little break until Nishma does her presentation. So, thank you.